This is to keep you from rotating your neck too much. Just look straight.
Ethan, can you move over there now?
Good morning, everybody. Randy's all by himself and everybody else is on this side. He's not that bad, I promise. I hope everyone's had a good week. We've heard the news of Sister June. As far as Sandy has said, there's not really any immediate plans being made. They're trying to plan for something a little bit more distant. So keep praying for the Saunders family. They'll probably do something later in the year for Sister June. So just keep that in mind. We'll let you know as soon as we can. Well, actually, I'm not going to announce that yet. I'll do that afterwards. Does anybody need a lesson book for... Okay. I've only got 3.
Well, let me have yours.
Great. Well, I mean, if you need it, sure, but I won't know what we're doing. Okay, Lum and Regina are on vacation. You all would have been proud of me. I was 9 o'clock, had coffee ready, I had everything done, and that's a first for me. So I'm excited to see what today holds. But we are going to begin on page 60. Outside of that, I don't really have any updates or anything other than Jim is still recovering from his surgery. Dad is still waiting on some test results from the liver specialist. I don't know anything else other than that. Does anybody have anybody that we need updates on or people to add to our prayer list? Nope. Okay. We'll go with that. I'd like to ask David if you would lead us in an opening prayer and then we'll begin. Thank you. Okay, so we are continuing on lesson 6. We're going through Peter's epistles, and we're going to begin chapter 4. Now, what's not good about this is we have to go through 19 verses. That's going to be really difficult for my elongated talking. But I do want to go just through a brief introduction. We're not actually going to read the introduction, but basically our lesson is going to entail this. So Peter's been talking about all throughout the book from chapter 1. Christians are going to suffer. Their faith is going to be tried like gold and refined under this purifying fire. And by the time they come out of this purification, they'll come out stronger on the other end. And what we're going to find from chapter 4 is Peter is going to make a relation between how Christ was, how he is, and what he can do for those who had struggled in the past, struggle in their present, and also might even struggle in their future. But he doesn't necessarily talk about this struggling per se in the end, because if you reflect on the life of Christ, there was a point where he was crucified, he was suffering, he was bruised, abused, spat upon, mocked. But what was the end result of everything that he did? He was exalted. He was glorified. What Peter is going to do is say the end result is not that you're going to continue suffering, even though you might suffer for a short while. But rather, if you suffer for a righteous cause, you too are going to be exalted. You're going to be glorified just like Jesus. Not to the position of Son of God, but a child of God. That's the exaltation that we're looking for, one who is faithful. Now, some of the things to keep in mind, if you look on page 60, I want you to look halfway through the page, and it starts referencing Hebrews chapter 11, verse 35. It would say, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of pains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, were slain with the sword, and they wandered about in sheepskin and goatskin, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. Basically, what Peter is going to do, he's going to say, how far can you go in persecutions? And literally, just that one quote, these are people who did not accept deliverance if it meant that they could have a better resurrection to the end of time. I think there's a principle that we can pull out of that, and we'll see that as we go throughout the lesson this morning. And if you look on page 61, a little bit towards the end, I want to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up from the bottom. It would say, consequently, Peter urged his audience to look to an example of Jesus as they faced persecution. And our lesson text begins with the following admonition. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourself with the same mind. That's exactly what we're going to do. And key note here, Christians should face persecution like Jesus. That's easier said than done. Now, we're going to look at that struggle and the conflict between the Christian, the inner man, and then suffering for a righteous cause throughout this morning's text. So we'll begin in 1 Peter 4, read the first 6 verses, and then if someone would like to read the section of our past for the next 2 pages, we can do that. The Bible would say, therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these things, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. And for this reason, the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit.
And then describe how Jesus suffered once for sin, sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, and declaring that Jesus is now in heaven and is at the right hand of God. Peter urged his readers to arm yourselves also with the same mind. The word mind is also translated way of thinking, purpose, or attitude. According to Gruden, the phrase means to think as Christ did without obedience and suffering, to be convinced that it is better to do right and suffer for it than to do wrong. 9 added, to survive persecution in an obedient manner, Christians must have proper mental preparation. In the context of Peter's letter, the proper attitude includes a steadfast hope for vindication, the fear of God, and a commitment to live, including suffering, in such a way that outsiders see the grace of God. But the fundamental attitude is that Christ surrendered himself to the God whom he knew would judge justly and save. Why should persecuted Christians imitate Jesus' mentality? They should do so in order to avoid selfish and ungodly behavior. For as Peter noted, he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. God once explained, to such an individual, these ornaments lose their appeal. Martyrs in the hour of persecution and death do not toy with temptation or surrender to the seductions of the world. Jesus did not shirk responsibility or choose personal safety over his mission. We must not choose the path of sin and ease over faithfulness to avoid persecution. Instead of focusing on self-preservation, Christians must choose to live for God's will. Those who are honest will acknowledge they have not always done so. For this reason, the Christian should not live for the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. This intentional turn to God should occur because we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, and we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, robberies, drinking parties, and in bondage for dominant idolatries. Fleshly pursuits may allow us to befriend the world, but they separate us from God. Christians have no business engaging in such sinful pursuits, regardless of how the world reacts. Those who speak unjustly about Christians and persecute them will eventually give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Peter's insistence that God will judge the living and the dead likely prompted the assurance he offered in the following verse. He wrote, "For this reason the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to the men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit." It is possible this statement was issued to answer the question Peter's audience had about their fellow Christians who had preceded them in death. Gordon summarized the verse's meaning as follows: that Christians are judged in the flesh as men means that they, like all men, die. Sin makes the same claim on physical lives of believers as non-believers. For the believers, however, it is not the end of the story, because Christ is the judge. They must live in the Spirit according to the will of God. Because of Christ, we can overcome our past.
Okay, there's a lot to take in here, and if you look at my book, I have a lot of things underlined because he makes a lot of good points. Basically, if you look in the text, what Peter is dealing with, if you look at verse number 2, he talks about those who are living for the will of God. In verse 3, those who are living for the will of the Gentiles. Now, another way of saying that is, how can I be pleasing to my Lord, or do I feel like being pleasing to the world? You're going to hear the word will a lot. We're not talking about will, but but the idea is, like, how are my thoughts? What am I longing for? What am I leaning toward? And how am I acting? If you look back on page 61, it makes the point there, the one who has the mind of Christ means to think as Christ did about obedience and suffering, to be convinced that it's better to do right and suffer than it is to do wrong. I often wonder at times, because the Bible doesn't reveal these things, what did Christ think? Well, the beauty about not knowing that is seeing it through his actions. When you start seeing, I guess, the reciprocation of how Christ interacted with others, both those who were righteous and those who were unrighteous, you start to see a little bit more of the character of Christ. And I think the adage is said, I'd rather see a sermon than hear a sermon any day. Well, that's a person's example. And that's what we're striving to go for. And that's what Peter is trying to admonish the Christians through here. Now, he talks about through here that if we're reflecting back or trying to be like the world, he would say, we've wasted enough time in verse 3. We've spent enough of our past lifetime doing the will of the Gentiles. And he talks about different kinds of sins. Lewdness, one who is kind of perverse, whether in his actions or speech or in his thoughts. Lust, one who goes after pleasures. Drunkenness. This isn't necessarily one who is infatuated with alcohol. This could be substance abuse, What I'm talking about here is anything that pollutes the mind from where you can no longer think straight. That's more than alcohol. Anything that can lower your inhibitions. Drinking parties, going together and saying, hey, let's drink, let's have fun. And abominable idolatries, giving homage to someone else. When you think about all the time that you spent in your younger years, or maybe you came to Christ later in life, the moment you came to Christ, maybe you did come to Christ later in life, you start reflecting back on all those opportunities you had when you were younger and you refused the truth. And then in your mind, after you become a child of God, you start wondering, why did I waste all that time? It's interesting, there's a family who was recently saved in Texas. They were given a Bible study opportunity. They took it. They studied the Bible for themselves and said, if we knew this sooner, we would have done it a whole lot earlier in our life. We wish we knew this sooner. Friends, that's the message of everyone who's alive and knows the gospel, and those who have passed from here and either did know the gospel or did not know the gospel. There's going to come a point where we can no longer make a choice whether or not we want to accept the gospel or not. But we don't want to have the regret of, after this life, finding that out. We want to find that out here on earth. And the only way we're going to figure that out is if we start looking back at our past. I'm not saying look back from the plow, but when you look back at your past and say, you know what, I did some wicked, awful things when I was younger. Friends, the best thing we can do is learn from those. Don't do them again, but also instruct those who are walking down that same path. Just because we walk down that path doesn't mean everybody else has to, because we say, well, you're going to learn it the same way I did. Friends, what if Jesus comes back tomorrow and you didn't stop them? And then Jesus comes to you and says, you had a chance. You had an opportunity to correct this erring child from the way of sin, and you just let him go down in there. True love involves sharing the truth. And that means if I see a brother or a sister who's going in an erring way, you which are spiritual, restore such a one, considering yourself with meekness and fear, lest you also be tempted. The idea is that we're trying to live a pure life. And it's hard enough for ourselves to keep ourselves pure. And we'll talk about that in the present that Peter's going to talk about. But when we start seeing other people veer off the wayside, friends, Jesus was selfless enough to go out of his way. Now, I've got an interesting statement when we get to the present aspect. Jesus went out of his way to make sure other people were taken care of. And I don't know how much personal time Jesus had, but it's probably a whole lot less than what we say, well, I need me time. Well, Jesus didn't have it that much. He had he time with the Father, but I don't know how much himself time he had. And there is a place for that. But Jesus always made a point. If someone could be helped, he went out and helped them. He wasn't reflecting on what people did to him in the past. He was sinless. We could use Paul or Peter. They're not reflecting on who they were in the past, though they could use those as powerful lessons. They used it to help push people into a present age where you can accept the gospel no matter who you were in the past. You can accept it today. There's a couple of other things that we could look into, but basically the point here, you can overcome your past for a better today. That's the idea. But any comments on that before we go to the next section?
Rip and I were talking a couple of days ago about the 12. And how would you know? Of course, we know Judas, we know Jesus, I think he probably knew this was the betrayer. But in all the time I've read about it, I don't know that he talked bad about Judas or treated him worse than he did the other man. I think that would be really hard to do, to know this is the guy's going to have him delivered up, and I'm going to treat him just like everybody else. I don't know. I don't think I can do that either.
Well, the harder part is like at that pivotal moment where he gives him over to the other people and he says, friend, why are you here? That's like crushing blow to the heart. It's like, dude, don't do that. But I mean, the point is, it's like, Judas, use your mind. You know what you're doing. You can change this, but his heart was already set to something else. But how do we face people who betray us? Well, in Jesus' case, he says they really don't know what they're doing. And even should they, like say maybe they knew the right way and they turned away from the right way and they're doing something wrong and wicked, for the most part, you're going to find that someone who has the understanding that wickedness is better than righteousness, there's a misunderstanding somewhere in their line of thinking. Now, the thing that we shouldn't do, well, I guess it depends on the situation. When you look in the book of Jude, it says that Satan and Michael were contending over the body of Moses. It says that Michael didn't come to Satan with some kind of railing accusation of, look how wicked you are. It just says, the Lord rebuke thee. Sometimes there's just some fights we don't need to pick up because they're just, that's not the right reaction. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't know how, the same way with me, I would not react that way. I wish I could, but not yet. I'm still in development. But good comment. Any other comments? Okay, our present. So we're going to look away from who we were in the past, and we're going to look not just, even though we may not have suffered in the past because of wrongdoing, he's going to turn it to the attention of our present and how we even struggle and suffer in different ways in the present age. Verse 7. It would say, but the end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. As each one of you has received a gift, minister it to one another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. And if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. And if anyone ministers, let him do it with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing has happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. And if you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. On their part, he is blasphemed, but on your part, he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a busybody in other men's matters.
Peter wanted his audience to know the persecution they faced would not last forever. And thus he reminded them that the end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. Scholars question Peter's opinion. Was he speaking on the second coming, or was he speaking on the destruction of Jerusalem? Both views have some merit. Wayne Jackson remarked, the phrase at hand might have been used in view of the potential, yet chronologically uncertain terminal event. Whether or not Peter thought the Lord would return at any moment, he correctly conveyed that Christians should live in view of that possibility. The delay in Jesus' coming, even 2,000 years later, does not detract from the point. We do not know when the Lord will come back. We do, however, know the delay in his return provides an opportunity for all to come to repentance. When the Savior returns, strife and opposition will cease, for at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow. So how do Christians live in view of the Lord's return? First, we must pray fervently. Peter urged his readers to be serious and watchful in prayer. The NIV translates the phrase, be alert and of a sober mind so that you may pray. According to Samuel, choosing to follow the will of the world results in wild, reckless living. Those who choose God's will are choosing alertness and sobriety. If one is going to live according to God's will, one must pray for guidance. Understand God's will and strength to carry it out. Second, we must have fervent love for one another. For love will cover a multitude of sins. Persecution from outsiders should cause Christians to emphasize with care and for one another, not bigger and higher. Genuine love enables us to look past momentary faults and unintended harshness. As Peter noted, the development of love is primary. Third, we live in view of the Lord's return by extending hospitality to one another without grumbling. Hospitality, of course, is an outgrowth of love. Schreiner observed, hospitality was one of the marks of the Christian community. Furthermore, hospitality was necessary in order for the church to maintain its homes. Words without grumbling acknowledge that those who open their homes may grow tired of that service. Hence, they are exhorted to be hospitable gladly, not caving into the temptation that begrudge their charity to others. Fourthly, use whatever talents or abilities we have for the good of others. As we do so, we must make every effort to rely upon God Those who live in fear of the Lord's return will not necessarily escape persecution, as Peter's audience already knew. He thus warned, "Beloved, do not think strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's suffering. For when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad and exceeding joy. If one is persecuted for the name of Christ, he or she will be blessed. This should not be confused with deserved punishment, which Christians should seek for the Lord."
Okay, I do want to address something because I think this is interesting. Every time we hear the phrase that the time is at hand, right now we're going through Revelation, and we're going to study Revelation 1 this coming Wednesday, Lord willing. And there were two key phrases that we've been talking about, or at least alluded to, that time cuffed the entire book. These things must shortly come to pass, and the time is at hand. Now, when we hear that word, either the end is at hand, we think apocalypse, nuclear warfare, and some kind of biohazard disease. That's not necessarily the case. And I would submit to you that I'm not necessarily thinking that what Peter has in mind is the Lord's return in the sense of the judgment. It could, but I don't think it means that. Look over at Isaiah chapter 13, and I want to ask you a question after we read this text of when did God come and bring judgment? If you look at Isaiah chapter 13, there's a parable, or at least a proverb, that's brought about Babylon. And it would say, "The burden against Babylon which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. Lift up the banner on high and raise your voice to them. Wave your hand that they may enter the gates of the nobles. For I have commanded my sanctified ones. I have also called my mighty ones for my anger, and those who rejoice in my exaltation. The noise of the multitude in the mountain, like that of many people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nation gathered together. The Lord of hosts musters the army for battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, and the Lord in his weapons of indignation to destroy the whole land." Now, question before we read the next verse. The Lord's going to gather an army. The Lord is going to destroy the land. Who is this against? According to verse 1, Babylon. Look at verse 6. "Wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It will come as destruction from the Almighty." You look down at verse 9. It says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it." Verse 11, "I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud and lay low the haughtiness of the terrible." What is God getting at through Isaiah towards Babylon? You're about to be taken out, man. You're about to be destroyed. Now, what's interesting when you go to Daniel chapter 5, what happened at the feast of Belshazzar that ended the reign of the Babylonians? A little handwriting on the wall, but the handwriting didn't mean that was the end of the kingdom. It was foretelling that, Belshazzar, you messed up. In fact, you've been weighed, you've been measured, your kingdom's been handed over to the Medes and Persia. And later that night, Belshazzar was slain, and Darius took the reins. Now, in a sense, the day of the Lord came that day. But what I mean by that is not like second coming of God or judgment. What I'm talking about is judgment upon a nation could be what's in consideration. Now, when we look at the text in 1 Peter chapter 4, what has Peter been alluding to the entire time in regards to the Christian? If you're a Christian, just like Christ, you too are going to suffer persecution. You are going to suffer. I think when Peter talks about in verse 7, the end of all things is at hand, I think he's talking about your struggles, your trials, the persecution that you're going through. It may not be the case that the Lord literally comes back in the flesh. That's the whole point of Revelation. It's going to seem as if Christ is riding on a white horse. It's going to seem as if the the Lamb that was slain is going to go into heaven, and he's going to open the scroll, and Babylon is going to fall again, that great and wicked city that all the kings look at and they say, who can stand against such a one? The idea is that These things are going to go away soon. And that's why we see this language through Revelation of this new heavens and a new earth. It's going to seem like a whole new world. You have a job that's terrible. We can talk about that. You have a job that's terrible and you just hate it. Well, what happens one day if all the policies change and suddenly the bosses are really nice to the employees? Actually, the policies are in favor of the employees now. It just seems like, what kind of work environment did I just come into? The day after an election, or at least when a new president is installed. What happened to the past president? Well, it's gone away. It seems like a new heaven and a new earth. It's a different environment. The idea of persecution passing on, that's the end of all things. And really, when you think about it, there's two key points that Satan can really hit the Christian. And he talks about it through here, and he even gives the solution of how to avoid it. Either when you're getting really close to the end of a trial, that's the best time for a Christian to give up. Or when you've been victorious, and Satan catches you off guard because you presume you have overseated the oppressor. Well, we need to heed the words of Peter. He would say we need to be serious and watchful in our prayers. Why? Because if you're not careful in the midst of trials and tribulations, you might actually turn back to who you were in the past. And Peter is saying, look, in the present age, that's not what Christians do. Think about what Christ would have done. He wouldn't have looked back in the past and said, you know what, I had a better time back then. I was reading through Job last night, and he talks about the idea of, I reflect on the days that I was in my prime, when the young people looked at me, and the nobles looked to me, and they sought wisdom from me, and I had gold, and I had all the possessions I could have. Yet when they look at me now, I'm now a byword and a proverb, and the men scoff me, and the women can't stand to be around me. My family doesn't want to be around me. And the idea is I had a better life back then. Sometimes that's our attitude towards the sinful lifestyle that we once had. And the problem with that kind of thinking is that's not better. Worldly gains does not correlate with God's favor and or God's blessing. You can be a faithful child of God, and you might have rich people in the kingdom and poor people in the kingdom. And in both of those tiers, God still says, be watchful in material things, be faithful to the Lord, endure trials and persecution. It's the same all around. He's not a respecter of persons, a person of profile and or of prophets. He's an all-just God. Now, if we look at life that way and try to live the way that Peter is trying to suggest here, praying fervently is a way that we're going to avoid the temptation of looking back. How can we endure? Pray. At the bottom of page 64, it says, second, we must have fervent love for one another. Jesus did more than just pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. If you recall, in between the times that he was praying, what did he do? He went back, he checked on his friends, and he came back. You know, it might be the case we need to say a prayer, go check on people, then come back to praying because nothing's happening in the stockyard, so to speak. We need to have a concern for others. Now, where that fine limit is, I can't really give you that. You've got to use really good judgment on that, or at least your best judgment in that. And I think what Peter is actually trying to say is, look, when you're going through struggle, sometimes it's good to have a breather and look the other way. Now, not for the cause, if you look at verse 15, not for the cause that you're trying to abuse people, steal from people, do wrong to people, and or trying to get in their business. That's not the point of checking on people. The point is that you genuinely concern about them. You genuinely love them. They're a child of God. They're made in the image of God just like you are. And even if this trial or this struggle is not getting fixed or there's a remedy to it and there's no solution to it, doesn't mean that all hope is lost. It might be the case that you just have to hit the pause button, let time do its thing, patience have a perfect work, and you go about doing the work of a Christian. What does that mean? I go and be an encouragement to others. It's really hard for us to be a Barnabas when we're being more of a Barabbas and we're trying to be, it's all about me. Well, no, it's not. He turned out being a prisoner and he was released. And Jesus took his place. Well, guess what? We're the ones who stole the place of the cross. And Jesus took our place. Why did we steal the Son of God? Well, God knew we needed him. It's interesting just how Peter says, look, you're going to want to be selfish when these trials exist and come about you. Don't do that. Love one another. And it's interesting he would bring out in verse 8, above all things, have fervent love for one another. And he says, this is how you do it. Be hospitable to one another and without grumbling. He brings out the idea, the commentator does on page 65, the third and fourth line down. He says, genuine love enables us to look past momentary faults and unintended harshness. There's certain individuals I can think of, and it's not everybody of this generation, but I have a hard time of reading the language of older generations. It's because y'all are just beyond my time, and I'm trying to figure out how you work. But what I mean by that is sometimes a phrase might be said, and I take it the wrong way, but then they meant something completely different, and I'm using my young guy vernacular. Dinner is not actually dinner. Dinner is lunch. Supper is dinner. And now that's a silly example, but sometimes whenever someone gets mad, they get really blunt and they get harsh all of a sudden, and they may not mean that in a harsh or an angry way. That's just their character. They're just blunt about it. For someone like me, I'm the kind of guy you need to fully explain things, otherwise I'm going to presume you're really mad at me, aggravated at me, and I did something bad. It may not be the case, and it may be a misunderstanding of communication. Well, we've got to understand in our Christian walk as well, Christians are going to react in a way that is not Christian-like. But that does not give us the reason to say, well, you're no longer a Christian, I have no reason to care about you. No, we're going to slip up from time to time. And whether it's like Peter, like Paul, I would say even Barnabas, even though it doesn't really talk about per se sins of Barnabas, we know all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We have to have a little bit of grace towards one another and a little bit of room, not necessarily to allow sin, but to understand those slip-ups are going to occur. And when they do, friends, that is the time where we go closer to one another. That is the perfect time for praying for one another. Because that is the moment where even though you might be slipping up, here, let me help you along the way. And if we became more understanding like that, we would understand the church is perfect, not made up of perfect people, but people who are trying to be like the perfect Savior. He didn't slip up. We will. Now, if God understands you're not going to obtain this level of perfection, but you can get pretty close to it. Friends, if God is understanding, we need to be the same. That's the idea. So secondly, have fervent love for one another. Even in the midst of persecution, don't be selfish. It shows the idea of even in persecution, if we extend hospitality to one another, it might be the case that we do something all the time and we're being generous to people and nobody cares. Nobody's showing any kind of reciprocation saying, I appreciate what you're doing. After a while, you no longer want to be hospitable. In fact, you're going to be spiteful in return because no one appreciated what you were doing to begin with. Peter says, don't. And he may not necessarily be talking about towards other Christians, but what if you're extremely hospitable to those in the world? You're trying to be understanding of them. They don't understand. Not that you saying, okay, whatever, and you're not acknowledging the sin that they're in, suddenly you accept what they're doing. That's not how that works. The idea is that even as we live in the world, there's a difference of being in the world and of the world. There's a very big difference. We don't have to accept what people are doing, but we do have to accept the fact that every single individual, whether you're a child of God or you're not, you're on a journey towards truth. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, you're looking for a purpose in life, you're looking for a pathway to go, you're looking for a career choice down the road if you want a job or something, or a family or a home or whatever your goals might be. Everybody has a direction they're going. Now we have to realize somewhere along that way, we're going to meet a lot of people that just don't know. And we're going to meet a lot of people who do know, and then they still do the wrong thing. And we're like, what were you thinking? Well, I wasn't. We got to show grace. That's hard. And finding those moments where Peter says, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. There's going to be times it says in the middle of their page, the words grumbling or without grumbling acknowledge that those who open their homes may grow tired of that service. Friends, let's never grow tired of the service that permits grace and permit salvation. We need to continue being Christians, no matter what others do to us. I have a side comment right there, and then I'm opening it up for comments. I was listening to a lesson of how we should respond to the hostility of the world today. And an idea came up that was how God shows mercy to us, we show mercy to others. Well, this is interesting, and I was going to do this as a lesson next week, but now that I'm giving it up, I'm not going to do it. When you look at the word mercy, you can take the letters, and there's a word, well, there's two words actually. There's me and cry. When you cry, me. Look at me. Do you see me? The idea of mercy, showing mercy to others. And even Jesus brings this out in Matthew 25. Inasmuch as you did it to those that were hungry, that were thirsty, that were naked, destitute of their daily provisions, were in prison and or sick, you did to me if you tended to them. That's what mercy is. When I see, you know what, if I was in that position, I would want someone to help me, regardless of where they are and their profitability, their class in life, their profile of life, whether they're a scoundrel and or they're someone who's very sincere. And we have to be wise, again, not cast our pearls before the swine. But the idea is that in mercy, whether or not the person thanks me or not, or they become rude and just bad towards me, it doesn't matter. Do you not think God sees that? Do you not think that you'll be glorified for doing the right thing, even though someone had the wrong response to you? It's hard for us to see those moments of mercy. The idea of extending hospitality in the greatest sense goes back to the idea, if we share the gospel with a lost and dying world, especially people who don't understand where they are in their present time, and they still might be in their past, so to speak, we still have to show mercy to them. God showed mercy to us. Why does that make us better than the people who are lost in the world? It doesn't. It doesn't. We live here for Christ. That means even in the midst of trials, persecutions, and wanting to give up, we become selfless, not selfish. There's some really good points in using our talents for what we have for the good of others, but I don't have time to go into it. Any comments on that? Will?
Lamentation talks about God's mercies are new every morning, and which is a very, just comforting thought. But then, if we're supposed to have the same mindset towards others, eventually we use the phrase, I'm at the end of my rope with this person, and we have a tank we eventually don't refill every morning, but ultimately we should be more like God because we rely on that new mercy every day, but a lot of times we don't do the same for other people.
Absolutely. And I think we've talked about this. What's the difference between grace and mercy? Grace is receiving something you don't deserve. Mercy is not receiving something you do deserve. No. Yeah, not receiving something you do deserve. And when you look at the idea of someone who's wicked, someone who's doing the wrong thing, if you look in the absolute sense of law, sin and righteousness do not go together. The idea of this I recall to my mind, and then I know the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are renewed every morning. The idea is there's a lot of things that could have happened to me that I really deserve because of what I've done. But God didn't let those things happen. Now, if we share that same love towards others, just like he said, man, that changes our perspective on a lot of things. And again, that goes back to, that's easier said than done. Good point. Any other comments? Okay, I'll read the verses and I'll kind of paraphrase what's in this last section. Beginning in verse 16. He would say, after you suffer for all these things in the present time, think about what's going to come in the future. He would say, yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God, and if it begins with us first, what will be with the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? Now if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Therefore let those who suffer according to the will of God, commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful Creator. Now, I'm not going to talk about this right now, but in the lesson we'll talk about it. You're going through a hard time and someone gives those words that I think they just say them because they don't know what else to say. Well, it's the will of God that you're suffering like this. Not necessarily, and you can't prove that. the idea of our future in the sense of suffering, Peter brings it back to the idea, if we're going to look at a glorious future, we need to, verse 19, continue to suffer the way that Christ did. That's the will of God, being obedient even under persecution, to commit your souls to Him who is doing good as to a faithful Creator. He brings it all the way back from the beginning of time, and he brings up this idea. Do you not think that God knew what He was doing from the beginning? Yes. Do you not think God knows what He's doing now? Yes. Do you not think that God has a plan for those who are righteous in the future? Yes. As the created in the image of His Son, the Christian is admonished to persevere, to trust, and to obey. That's going to be hard, but that's the challenge that Peter presents for the Christian in suffering. Any comments before we close? Okay, you're free from my encampment and bondage, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes. Thank you.